Hey guys, thanks for joining me again in our study of Ruth. We're to Ruth chapter 2. I'm still, as you can tell, in the mountains up here in New Mexico on vacation, but I mean, what a perfect place to be studying God's Word and read about it. You know, last week we looked at Ruth 1, and a little background as we get going. There was a famine in the land, and Elimelech took his wife from from Judea to the promised land, and they went to Moab, to God's enemies. And while they were there, while they were in the land in Moab for 10 years, Elimelech dies, and his two sons marry Moabite women, and they die, and the sons die, and you've got Naomi left with two daughters-in-law. And you know, last week we saw in our study last week that they started home. There was hope in Jerusalem. After 10 years, the famine was over. God had fed his people, and these three widow ladies, head home. And midway, Naomi tries to talk her daughter-in-laws into turning around staying in Moab. And Orpah went home. Orpah turned around and left, and she went back to her people. But the Bible said Ruth clung to her people. And I want to read you to remind you what Ruth said when Naomi was trying to talk her into it. And Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I go. Where I lodge, you lodge." It says, "Your God shall be my God, your people my people." It says, "Where I die, you'll die." You see it in Ruth, this Moabite woman. We're going to start to see how God works through her life. We're going to start to see her trust in this new God and how that works out. And we're going to, as we pick up in this story, as we pick up into chapter 2, and we go on, as they go back into Bethlehem, and it says these ladies returned till they hit Bethlehem. You know, a many-mile journey, took several days. I mean, you could tell they were probably weary from their travels. You know, 10 years of living in a foreign land, the people start to say, "Is this Ruth? Is this Ruth?" And it says when she gets there, as the people start to say, is this Ruth that's returned? Ruth says, "Don't call me Ruth." She says, "Call me Mark," because it kind of stirred the people up. Here's a widow here's one of our people we hadn't seen for 10 years with this little Moabite woman. And I want to look real quick in verse 20 of chapter 1, and it says, she said, "Don't call me Naomi." She says, "Call me Mara, for the Lord Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." And it says, "I went away full, and he's brought me back empty." It says, "Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me?" And all the calamities brought up. Because you see, Naomi, the word Naomi means pleasant. And she says, "Don't call me pleasant. Call me Mara." Mara means bitter. She was real bitter when she returned home. But let's look into chapter 2. And starting in chapter 2, reading in verse 1, it says, Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And you see, we get a whole lot in this story. You see, when he talks about the clan of Elimelech, you had families that were close, like your close relatives. And then you had clans who were like your distant relatives. And then they had the 12 tribes of Judah, or of Israel. And this man, and when it says a worthy man, a man of noble stature, a good man. Boaz the people liked him. He was an honorable man. He's a godly kind of man. But him being, it says it was of that clan. You see, and we're going to see where that comes into play a little bit more in the story. And then we go on, and it says, Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, Ruth says to her mother-in-law, "Let me go to the field to glean among the ears of grain." This is after him in whose sight that I shall find favor. And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out, and she went and she gleaned in the fields after the reapers. And it happened to come to a part in the field that belonged to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to the young man, who was in charge of the reapers, "Who's this young woman? Whose woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She's the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." And she said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So they came, and she continued from early morning until now with except for a short rest. You see back in verse 2 when you see Ruth talking about, "I'm going with you, Naomi. I'm going to stay with you." You know, usually the sons took care of their mother when she was a widow. And usually in that time, if you had a daughter-in-law and her husband died, usually a brother would marry her and redeem her so she could have children and have things. And you see, there's the way it was set up, there was nowhere for that. You remember last week I said we would see how the hand of God works? You see, God had in his law set up that people that own fields, when it come time to harvest, they could harvest right up to the edges. But God says, don't harvest the edges of the fields. He said, leave that behind for those that are widows and orphans that have no way to fend for themselves. They can, to grow their own crops, they can come out and they can harvest. But you remember I also said we're living in a time that people were doing whatever was right in their own eyes. So you know not all the Israelite people were doing that. Some of them were cleaning their fields. And Naomi says, I'm going to go out to whoever's him. And when she says him, she don't know who it is. Excuse me. She says, I'm going out to a field hoping I can find somebody to let me pick grain along the edges. And while she's there, verse 3 says she happened to come to Boaz's field. You know, and you can say that it's a coincidence, but all through this story, you see the mighty hand of God. I told you we might see some wildlife. It looked like a rabbit just run by. But anyway, it said there was a mighty hand of. We see the sovereignty of God at work. You see, I don't think it's a coincidence she found Boaz's field. I think God had this story set up that she found a field of a noble character, and not only that, of a relative that's going to turn out to be a redeemer, like a kinsman redeemer for her. And he asked, and he comes into the field, and it's just like somebody that owns the field. He looks up and there's somebody that's not supposed to be there, somebody that wasn't his, and he says, who is this young girl? And let's go on and see what Boaz says when the servant says, that's Ruth, the Moabite woman that came with Naomi. And it says, then Boaz says to Ruth, it says, now listen, my daughter, do not go glean at another field or leave this one, but keep close with my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they're reaping. It says, and go after them. It says, I have not charged the young men not to touch you. It says, and when you're thirsty, you go to the vessel and drink that the young men have drawn. It says, then she fell on her face and she bowed to the ground with him. And she said, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me since I'm a foreigner? You see what's real strange about this story? In our modern culture, you don't think a whole lot of it. Well, he owns the field. He going to go over and talk to her. Well, see, back then, you wouldn't have had a noble man go over and talk to a woman, especially a foreign woman. But this noble man goes over and he talks to her and he tells her, he says, don't go to no other fields. Because you see, for her being a foreigner, it probably wasn't safe. Even if they were Israelites and the Israelites saw an Israelite widow and allowed that, but now there's a foreigner in your field. And what Boaz is saying, and you see God working through Boaz, giving this young woman protection, giving her food. He says, you stay in my fields. You glean in my fields. My men won't hurt you, and you'll be protected. You stay with the women that are gleaning my fields. And I tell you another interesting part when he says, when you're thirsty, you go drink from the water that my men drew. You see, back in that day, what's kind of cool about that? Back in that day, women drew water for the men. Women weren't thought of as high as men were. So that's a real unique deal for the owner of the field to tell a foreign Moabite woman, you go drink the water that my men drew when you're thirsty. And she falls and she says, how come I found favor in your eyes? Now listen to this. This is the part of the story I want you to hear about Ruth's character. Verse 11 says, but now Boaz answered her, all that you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of her husband has been fully told to me. How you left your father and mother in your native land and you came to the people and you did not know them. And he kind of says a prayer over. He says, the Lord repay you for what you've done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord of Israel, under whose wings you have come under refuge. Then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. You see, she says, I'm not even worthy to be considered a servant. She humbled herself before him and put herself lower than the rest of them. You see, and in his prayer, he kind of answers, he says, may the God give you refuge and protection under his wing. When really God used Boaz because Boaz says, you got protection in my fields. Then the story breaks and it says a little while later, it says, and at mealtime Boaz said to her, come and eat some of the bread and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers and he passed her roasted grain. She ate until she was satisfied and then some leftovers. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed the young man, let her glean even among the sheaves. Do not reproach her, and also put out some of the bundles for her, and leave in the fields for her to glean. Do not rebuke her. So she gleaned in the field until evening, and she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. You see, Boaz brought her to the table. Boaz brought her in, and you stop and think, how do you really get to know somebody? It's one thing to say hi and be kind and give somebody something to eat, but if you let them sit at your table, you get to know them. She got to know the people she was around. She felt comfortable. She had peace, and not only that, he'd already given her an opportunity to gather grain and feed herself, but he made it easy on her. He told his workers, when you cut the grain and you tie it into bundles, pull some of that good grain out and lay it on the ground, so all she has to do is pick it up. You see in this ephah that they were talking about, a barley, we're not exactly sure on the weight, but that comes out to about 30 or 40 pounds of grain that she left after that one day of grain. And you see what's crazy, a normal worker that day, his wages for the day was 3 to 4 pounds of grain. And she leaves with this big old sack, 30 or 40 pounds, and she heads back to the city to her mother-in-law. And now remember, Naomi, the mother-in-law, was bitter, and was bitter in the story, and she hoped that her daughter-in-law might find a place maybe to get them just enough something to eat. But let's finish this story out real quick and look at the change in the mother-in-law. And it says, and she took it up, and she went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. And she also brought out and gave her food that she had left over, being satisfied. Think about that. The mother-in-law's hoping she comes home with enough grain they can fix maybe some bread or something. She carries this big old sack in and sets it down and goes, oh yeah, here's my leftover, the roasted grain that I got to eat for lunch, that I eat till I was full. Here, I even got you a good meal for tonight. It says, and her mother-in-law said, where did you glean today? Where have you worked? Said, blessed be the man that took notice of you. So she told her mother-in-law, and you see now you get to this part of the story, Naomi knows Boaz is a relative, but she don't know Ruth's been in the field of Boaz. Ruth knows she's been in Boaz's field, but she don't know he's a redeemer and kinfolk. So she says, a man's name whom I worked today was Boaz. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may the blessings of the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi also said to her, this man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. And Ruth the Moabite said to her, besides, he said to me, you shall keep close to my young until they have finished all the harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter-in-law, that you go out with the young woman, lest another field be assaulted. So she kept close to the young women, and she gleaned until the end of barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. You see, as you look into this story and you see the characters, you see the hand of God at work. But you see, Boaz is a picture of God and God's salvation and the way God takes care of us. Because you see, last week I talked about Ruth being the image of somebody getting a fresh start with God. She didn't know where she's going. She didn't know what it was going to look like. But she said, your God's my God. And she puts her trust in this God. And what does God do for us? Just like Boaz did for her. When God looks up and he sees us and we don't belong to him, he says, who is that? And just like in this story, Boaz goes over and talks to Ruth. God calls us. And he offers her a place in his field. He offers her a place at his table. He offers to feed her, protect her, to meet her needs. And that's just what God's done for me and you. He calls us, and when he calls us, all we have to do is just like Ruth did. She accepted the offer. And salvation's as simple as that. You just accept what God's offered. Just kind of like Boaz offered her protection, a place, a belonging, part of the family. God's called you to be part of his family. And I hope that you'll make that decision today. Hey, thanks for joining me again. And I hope you'll be checked back with us for Ruth chapter 3.